The sun was setting on that quite March evening as two young friends, hand in hand, walked away from their homes. Little did they know, this innocent stroll would be their last. In the shadows hides a figure with bad intentions, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As darkness fell, the children vanished without a trace, leaving their families desperate for answers. What should have been a quick walk turned into a parent's worst nightmare, their beloved children missing without explanation. For months, hope mingled with fear as an intensive search yielded no clues. Then, on a summer day nearly 3 months later, a gruesome discovery in the woods shocked the community and broke hearts across the nation.
It was around two personalities within Ronald Jebb's that his fantasies were built. To take two children off the streets to something that he had prepared and fulfill his fantasy. Sexual gratification, the deaths, the killing, the control over two young children, and the horror that he was causing. That was important to him.
2.5 years into the investigation, there was still no result. In August 1998, the case was being wound down when Jebson called from prison. He said he wanted to confess to killing Gary Hanlon and Susan Blatchford.
This is the true story of a case that came to be known as the Babes in the Wood murders, a tragic mystery that would take nearly 30 years to solve. Join us as we unravel the disturbing details of this cold case and the twisted mind behind these heinous acts. In the early 1970s, the peaceful suburb of Enfield in North London was a place where children could safely play outside and walk to friends' houses without worry. It was in this idyllic setting that our story unfolds, centered around two young friends, 11-year-old Susan Blatchford and 12-year-old Gary Hanlon. Susan was a spirited girl, the youngest of 4 sisters. With her tomboyish nature, she loved football, climbing trees, and playing with boys' toys. She was eagerly looking forward to being a bridesmaid at her sister Linda's upcoming wedding. Gary, on the other hand, was a shy boy, but described as plucky by his family. The youngest of 3 siblings, his great passion was football, a shared interest that formed the foundation of his friendship with Susan. On the afternoon of March 31, 1970, Susan left her home on Riley Road just after 4:30 p.m. to visit Gary, who lived nearby on Maryline Avenue. When she arrived, Gary's mother Beryl answered the door. Susan simply asked, "Is Gary there?" Moments later, Gary joined Susan outside, asking his mother's permission to go for a walk. Beryl agreed, reminding him to be back in an hour for dinner. The 2 children were last seen walking hand in hand down Maryline Avenue, with Gary carrying his beloved football under one arm. Around 5:30 p.m., a final sighting placed them crossing a nearby field. After that, Susan and Gary seemed to vanish into thin air. By 8 p.m., with no sign of the children returning home, their parents filed missing person reports at the local police station. Little did they know, this would mark the beginning of a heartbreaking ordeal that would span decades. The next morning, as snow blanketed Enfield, the Metropolitan Police launched an extensive search operation. Chief Superintendent Leonard Reed took charge, eventually deploying up to 600 officers full-time on the case. The community held its breath, hoping for good news, but fearing the worst as days turned into weeks with no trace of Susan and Gary. Investigators delved deeper into the lives of Susan and Gary. They discovered that despite their close friendship, the two had only recently become acquainted at Albany School. This fact, combined with the children leaving behind all personal belongings, quickly dispelled any notion that they might have run away. Missing person posters were distributed far and wide, describing Susan as 5 feet tall, last seen wearing a green raincoat with red stitched pockets, a floral blouse, and brown corduroy slacks. Gary was described as just 4 feet 2 inches tall, wearing a brown cardigan, fawn-patterned pullover, and blue jeans. The scale of the investigation was immense. Police conducted house-to-house inquiries at over 4,350 homes in the area. More than 15,000 people were interviewed, including several individuals with concerning backgrounds. Underwater search teams combed local waterways, while search and rescue dogs scoured over 5,000 acres of fields and woodland. Despite these exhaustive efforts, no clues surfaced. By mid-April, Scotland Yard had joined the manhunt, expanding the search nationwide. The Daily Mirror even published a front-page article offering a £1,000 reward for the children's safe return. However, as days turned into weeks, hope began to fade. Then, on the evening of June 17, 1970, a full 78 days after Susan and Gary disappeared, a young man named Leonard Cook was walking his Labrador dog near the edge of Epping Forest. As they approached a densely wooded copse, Cook's dog suddenly darted into the undergrowth and refused to return. Concerned, Cook ventured in to investigate. What he discovered would shake the community to its core. Hidden within a crude shelter made of branches and bracken, Cook spotted something that made his blood run cold, a child's foot. He immediately alerted the authorities, who rushed to the scene. Inside the makeshift hide, investigators made a grim discovery. The bodies of Susan and Gary lay side by side, with Susan's arm draped across Gary's body. Leaves, twigs, and branches had been used in an attempt to conceal them. The children's clothing, including their underwear, had been removed, and some items were torn in a way that suggested deliberate action. The discovery of Susan and Gary's bodies sent shockwaves through the community. Due to the advanced state of decomposition, pathologist James Cameron could only confirm their identities through dental records. This decay also made it challenging to determine the exact cause of death or if the children had experienced any physical harm. Despite the lack of clear evidence, several aspects of the scene troubled investigators. The way the children's clothing had been removed and repositioned suggested they hadn't simply lost their way and succumbed to the elements. However, without concrete proof of foul play, authorities found themselves in a difficult position. In September 1970, Coroner Charles Clark held an inquest into the children's deaths. Unable to definitively determine what had happened, Clark returned an open verdict. He suggested that wild animals might have been responsible for disturbing the children's clothing, a theory that did little to comfort the grieving families. Susan's mother, Muriel, was particularly vocal about her doubts. She repeatedly told reporters that the only animal capable of removing her daughter's undergarments while leaving her outer clothing intact must have been human. Her instincts, shared by Gary's parents and many investigators, pointed to a far more sinister explanation. Superintendent Leonard Reed, who had led the initial search, remained convinced that Susan and Gary had met with foul play. In his final report on the case, he wrote, "Unless somebody surrenders himself or comes into custody and admits this offense, it is most unlikely that it will ever be resolved." His words would prove eerily prophetic. With no clear evidence of a crime, the case gradually went cold. Physical evidence from the scene wasn't preserved, further complicating any future investigations. Years passed, and the tragic story of the babes in the wood faded from headlines, but never from the hearts of those who knew and loved Susan and Gary. For nearly 3 decades, the truth about what happened on that March afternoon in 1970 remained hidden. Families were left to wonder, and a community lived with the unsettling knowledge that whoever was responsible for the children's fate might still be walking among them. In May 1996, a man serving a life sentence for an unrelated crime reached out to Scotland Yard with information about the babes in the wood case. This unexpected development would set in motion a chain of events that would finally bring answers and justice for Susan and Gary. The man who contacted Scotland Yard in 1996 was Ronald Jebson, a convicted offender serving time for harming another child. At first, Jebson claimed he had only witnessed what happened to Susan and Gary, placing blame on others. However, investigators quickly saw through this deception. It wasn't until August 1998 that Jebson finally revealed the full horrifying truth. He confessed to being solely responsible for what happened to Susan and Gary on that fateful day in 1970. Jebson's background painted a troubling picture. Born Ronald Harper in 1938, he was adopted as an infant and his surname changed. Growing up in Hatfield, Hertfordshire, Jebsen was a loner with a history of concerning behavior starting in his teens. By 1970, he had a long record of various offenses. According to Jebsen's confession, he encountered Susan and Gary by chance while driving home from a job interview. He persuaded the children to get into his car, then took them to a secluded spot near Epping Forest, where he had previously built a hidden shelter. What followed was a parent's worst nightmare. Jebsen admitted to physically harming both children despite their resistance. He described how Gary watched in shock as he attacked Susan and then turned on Gary when the boy tried to intervene. Afterward, Jebsen rearranged their clothing and left them side by side in the shelter. To verify Jebsen's account, authorities made the difficult decision to exhume Susan's body for further examination. The findings supported key details of Jebsen's confession, particularly regarding the nature of her injuries. On March 28, 2000, nearly 30 years after Susan and Gary disappeared, Jebsen was formally charged with their deaths. He pleaded guilty on May 9 at the Old Bailey. Judge David Stokes, calling Jebsen wicked and perverted, sentenced him to 2 additional life terms. The families of Susan and Gary finally had answers, but the pain of their loss remained. They thanked the dedicated investigators, particularly retired Chief Superintendent Leonard Reed and his successor, Detective Chief Inspector Declan Donnelly, for their tireless efforts to solve the case. Jebsen never left prison. He passed away in 2015 at the age of 76, having spent over 40 years behind bars for his crimes against children. The Babes in the Wood case left an indelible mark on British society, sparking discussions about child safety and the need for improved investigative techniques. It also highlighted the importance of never giving up on cold cases, as justice can sometimes be served even decades later. In the aftermath of Jebsen's conviction, several changes were implemented in how missing children cases are handled. Law enforcement agencies began to collaborate more closely, sharing information and resources to improve the chances of solving such cases quickly. The public also became more vigilant, with communities working together to keep children safe. The families of Susan and Gary, while relieved to finally have closure, continued to advocate for victims' rights. They worked with organizations like the Victims of Crime Trust to support other families going through similar ordeals. Their efforts helped raise awareness about the long-lasting impact of such crimes on families and communities. The media played a significant role in keeping the case alive in public memory. Several documentaries and books have been produced about the Babes in the Wood murders, ensuring that Susan and Gary are not forgotten. These productions not only tell their story, but also serve as cautionary tales and educational tools for future generations. One such documentary, The Truth About the Babes in the Wood, aired in July 2002 as part of the Real Crime series. It provided a detailed look at the case, featuring interviews with investigators and family members. Another episode, part of the Murder Casebook series, explored the crimes of Ronald Jebsen, offering insights from criminologists. The case has also been featured in several true crime books, including Bodies of Evidence by Brian Innes and The Murder Guide to Great Britain by Brian Lane. These works not only recount the details of the case, but also place it within the broader context of British criminal history. The Babes in the Wood case continues to be studied by law enforcement and forensic science students. It serves as an example of how advances in forensic techniques can help solve cold cases, and how persistence in investigation can eventually lead to justice. In Enfield, where Susan and Gary lived, the community has found ways to remember them. While respecting the family's privacy, local schools have incorporated lessons on personal safety into their curricula, using age-appropriate methods to teach children about potential dangers without causing undue fear. As time passes, the Babes in the Wood case remains a powerful reminder of the vulnerability of children and the responsibility of society to protect them. It stands as a testament to the dedication of law enforcement officers who refuse to let cold cases go unsolved, and to the resilience of families who never stop seeking the truth. The story of Susan Blatchford and Gary Hanlon, the Babes in the Wood, will forever be a part of British criminal history. Their tragic fate serves as a solemn reminder of the innocence of childhood and the dark realities that can threaten it. May their memory continue to inspire efforts to keep children safe and bring wrongdoers to justice, no matter how long it takes.